generalize this now to non-biological systems as well. For example, we can ask the question of some future super-intelligent computer. Is it conscious or not? So to do this, let's look at systems, let's look at states of matter with emergent phenomena that have something to do with information. To store information, it has to have the physical properties that has some states that are just very long-lived. Most solids will do for this, like my wedding ring, for example. If I engrave my wife's name in this metal, this information will still be there years from now. But if I instead engraved it in a puddle of water, the information will be lost within seconds, right? For a more fun example, let's look at computronium, which is a name given to the most general substance that can compute. There's not enough for it to be able to store information, but it also has to be able to process information. The laws of physics have to make the computronium change over time in a sufficiently complicated way that it can implement arbitrary information processing schemes. Let's define perceptronium also as the most general substance that's conscious, that has a subjective experience. And let's ask, what properties does perceptronium have to have? I think it has to have, first of all, the same properties as computronium, but at least one more property that I want to get back to. But first, we just have to ask ourselves, how can something as physical as a bunch of moving particles possibly feel as non-physical as our consciousness? Well, I think it's because our consciousness is a phenomenon that doesn't only have properties above and beyond those of its parts, but also has properties that are rather independent of its parts, independent of its substrate, independent of the stuff that it's made of. We actually have other phenomena in physics that are also substrate independent in this sense. For example, waves. Waves have properties like wavelength and frequency and speed, and we can describe them really, really accurately with equations, even without knowing what kind of substance the waves are waves in. So these waves, they take a life of their own, above and beyond the substrate. For example, a wave can cross a lake, even though the individual water molecules are just going around in tiny little circles. Computation is also rather substrate independent, because Alan Turing famously proved that any computation can be performed by any substance as long as it has a certain minimum set of abilities to compute. So this means that if you were a self-aware computer game character trapped in your game world in some game in a future super-intelligent computer, you would have no way of knowing whether you were running on Windows, on Mac OS, or on some other platform, because you would be substrate independent. Now, I think consciousness is the same way. I think consciousness is a physical phenomenon that feels non-physical, because it's just like waves and computations. More specifically, I think that consciousness is the way information feels when it's being processed in certain complex ways. So this means that it's substrate independent, and this also means that it's only the structure of the information processing that matters, not the structure of the matter that's doing the information processing. In other words, we have the laws of physics, right? And they govern these motions of stuff. If the motions obey certain principles, we can get this emergent phenomena of computation, information processing. But now we can take this idea to another level. We can say, suppose this information processing obeys certain principles. Then we can get a higher level emergent phenomena, consciousness. So what would these principles be? We, of course, don't know what sufficient conditions are for a physical system to be conscious, but let me tell you about 4 necessary conditions that I've explored in my work. I've already argued that consciousness is the way that information feels when it's being processed. So for a physical system to be conscious, then, first of all, it has to be able to store information, like a computer, and it has to be able to process information, like a computer. But it also, I think, needs to be relatively independent of the rest of the world, because otherwise this conscious entity would not feel like it had any sort of independent existence at all. And finally, like Giulio Tononi argued, I think that this system has to be relatively integrated into a unified whole, because otherwise, if you have 2 independent systems, then this is going to feel like two separate conscious entities rather than one. Okay, so what do we make of this idea then that consciousness is the way information feels when being processed by particles moving around in certain ways? Is it good news or is it bad news? Well, I think it's good news. And if someone argues that it's bad news because they don't like the idea of being just a bunch of particles, then I object to their use of the word just. Because let's face it, you guys are not just a bunch of particles. Your brains are the most beautifully complex space-time patterns in our entire known universe. And moreover, as I've argued, your consciousness has properties above and beyond those of your particles that are in fact rather independent of your particles. So it's not the particles, but the patterns that really matter. I also think this is good news because it means that in our quest to understand consciousness, we're not stuck waiting for some missing ingredient. So this is really about asking the right question. And instead of asking, we're stuck, so what missing thing can we blame our failure on? Right? Let's instead ask the question, might it be, despite how it all seems, that we already have all the ingredients we need to solve our problem? I think this question is actually a very powerful one, both in science and in our everyday lives. And I hope you'll try it out yourselves. For example, people used to ask, what new undiscovered force prevents the moon from falling down? Nothing, Isaac Newton came along and said. The moon obeys the same laws of physics, he said, as everything else. And this bold idea, of course, revolutionized modern science. Then you can ask, what is it that breathes life into a clump of atoms and makes it alive? Again, scientists have discovered that the answer is nothing, because the difference between a dead bug and a living bug isn't that you add some sort of secret life sauce to it. It's simply the pattern into which the particles are arranged that matters. Then you can ask, what breathes fire into an information processing system and makes it conscious? Well, I've argued here tonight that, again, the answer is nothing, because what matters is simply the structure of the information processing. And finally, if our entire cosmos turns out to be perfectly described by physical laws, like modern physics suggests, then we can ask Stephen Hawking's famous question, what is it that breathes fire into a mathematical structure and makes a universe for it to describe? Well, I've argued that consciousness is a mathematical pattern, which means that some mathematical patterns simply are conscious, which means that the answer to this question is also nothing, because the only difference then between a structure that exists only mathematically and one that also exists physically is not the presence of some sort of physical existence, magical angel dust. It's simply its structure. So here is the idea that I would like you all to take with you tonight. Instead of asking, what do we need to add to physics to explain consciousness? Consider the idea that maybe we don't need to add anything at all. That because consciousness is simply the way information feels when it's being processed in certain complex ways by particles moving around in very special patterns. And let us instead ask, what are these patterns? What are their physical properties? Because it's not the particles, but the patterns that really matter.